Namaskar, students. In today's session, I will be continuing the discussion on the literary features of the Victorian age. Today, we will be discussing the non-fictional characteristics of prose written during the Victorian age. Some of the notable writers that contributed to the Victorian age non-fictional prose were Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, John Henry Newman, Matthew Arnold, Charles Darwin, William Morris, and Walter Pater. Due to the increase in the audience, due to especially the increase in the literacy amongst the middle class English people, there was a growth in periodicals and newspapers. There was a significant rise in the number of people who started reading periodicals and newspapers. Victorian non-fictional prose was didactic in nature. It was religious also. There were several pieces which were written, which consisted about religion, which talked about religion, talked about Christianity. A very famous movement is associated with Christianity during the Victorian age, which is also called the Oxford movement. We will discuss in detail about Oxford movement further. Prose was also about art and architecture. John Ruskin especially discussed about various aspects of art, architecture. Literary criticism was also written. Matthew Arnold primarily contributed to the literary criticism written during the Victorian age, and scientific writing by Charles Darwin. We all discussed in the socio-political scenario video how Charles Darwin was influential in creating this rift, creating this conflict in terms of faith versus reason, religion versus science, because several articles, several books and researches that he did during the Victorian age, and he published his research. And these publications, it led to a revolt. They were highly rejected and scrutinized. Critical pieces about religion, critical pieces in terms of scientific writing is what Charles Darwin wrote. And his research proved to be creating a conflict in the mind of the people. Let us discuss these main aspects about Victorian non-fictional prose. Didacticism. What do we understand by the word didactic? Something that we teach or preach. Something that contains an element of morality. Now, Victorian non-fictional prose was didactic in nature. There were several moralistic writing which was written during that time. Such moralistic writing, such didactic writing was published in the form of essays, pamphlets, tracts, and books. Primarily, Thomas Carlyle, Matthew Arnold, and John Henry Newman contributed in didactic writing. One aspect common in majority of Victorian age non-fictional prose writers is that most of them, I would not say all of them, most of them looked at Victorian middle class with contempt. They hated the materialistic advancements that Victorian middle class people were enjoying at that time. Attempts were made to reform the middle class. Most of the writers felt that we need to reform, we need to teach and preach the middle class people of England. Thomas Carlyle, who is also known as the Sage of Chelsea, was called as Sage. So he wrote Past and Present, published in 1843, where he condemns materialism and hedonism of the people of England. Hedonism is the aspect to only look after the happiness, pleasures. The pleasure-seeking aspect is hedonism. And he criticized materialism and hedonism in this work, Past and Present, in 1843. This is what he himself said about the work, Past and Present. And he writes, Past and Present is a moral, political, historical, and a most questionable, red-hot, indignant thing. For my heart is sick to look at the things now going on in England. He hated some of the aspects that were going on in England. He hated materialism. He hated hedonism. And especially the English middle class people enjoying, immersing themselves in materialism and hedonism, he hated it. And that is why he wrote this thing as a questionable, red-hot, indignant thing. He tried to pose questions, he tried to raise questions about several aspects of the Victorian age. Moving on. Matthew Arnold was also a significant writer who tried to teach people, who inculcated morality in his writings. He emphasizes that materialism is not the true criteria of national achievement. He emphasized that success of a nation cannot be measured by the materialistic comfort that any nation provides to the people. That is not the criteria. He abhorred the material advancement that England was making. Again, something common to what Thomas Carlyle was writing about. Matthew Arnold was highly critical of laissez-faire policy. What is this laissez-faire policy? It means let it be. Government will not be interfering in terms of trade, commerce, or economics. This is an economical aspect, and Matthew Arnold was highly critical of this policy where government does not interfere in trade or commerce or economic activities. because he believed that there has to be centralization and state control. We cannot leave trade, commerce, economics to individuals. Government has to have a certain level of control over all these activities. Matthew Arnold also hated the middle class mindset for materialism, and he wanted to educate and reform them. He had faith on literary culture. He believed in literature. He had faith in literature, and he felt that literature has the power that can save religion from religious fundamentalists and dogmatists. So that was what his faith was on literature. Religious writing. A very important movement, Oxford movement, is associated during the Victorian age. The movement emphasized on rituals and doctrines. Oxford movement, it focused on rituals, such as how should a Sunday Mass be conducted? If I can provide an example. So, organization of Sunday Mass, organization of several religious activities. It emphasized on rituals and doctrines. That was what Oxford movement was all about. John Henry Newman and John Keble, they were the leaders of this movement. This movement is also called Tractarian movement because of the publication of tracts for the times. The primary objective of this movement was to reform the Anglican Church, which is also known as the Church of England. So to bring on the changes in Anglican Church, to modify the customs, the rituals, the doctrines of Anglican Church, they proposed and they advocated and they wrote about several rituals and doctrines which should be inculcated in any religious activities, especially to reform the Anglican Church. So that was what Oxford movement was all about. Art and architecture. John Ruskin, he published the work Modern Painters, which is in 5 volumes. The first volume was published in 1843, the last and the 5th volume in 1860. Now, primarily, the reason why he started writing, the reason why he published Modern Painters is that he wanted to defend a painter named William Turner. He wanted to defend the painter from several accusations that society levied on him. Another important work that he published was Stones of Venice. What John Ruskin did is that he infused his art critical treatises with morality. And he writes, you cannot paint or sing yourselves into being good men. You must be good men before you either paint or sing. And then the color and sound will complete in you all that is best. To explain this quotation, he says that you cannot paint or sing yourselves into being good men. When you start creating a painting or when you start singing yourself, that is not going to make you a good person. But internally, even before you start painting or even before you start singing, you must be a good person. And if you are a good person, then your work, whether it's an artwork or whether it's a singing, it's a song, and then the color and sound will complete in you. It will be complete in you only if you are a good person. And if you are a good person, the color and sound will be complete. With apology, will complete in you all that is best. So that was what how he connected art with morality. You know, any artwork can become better only if the artist is a good person. And that's how he infused, his treatises, art treatises with morality. Unto this last, a very famous collection of essays which was published in 1860. I believe you have it in your acquaintances. In this particular work, he emphasizes that art and economy should have a moral basis. Unto this last is a collection of 4 essays. After they were published in 1860, there was a huge revolt against the ideas that John Ruskin mentioned in these essays, which is why only 4 of his essays were published. And in this work, he emphasizes that art and economy should have a moral basis. That is how, that much importance is what he levies on art and economy. If I would like to share, if I can share a very important aspect about this work is that this work had a huge influence on Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, he was highly influenced when he read this work, and this work instilled in him the ideas to fight with non-violence. So that is what John Ruskin's contribution is to art and architecture. Criticism. Matthew Arnold primarily contributed to literary criticism during the Victorian age. He published this work, Essays in Criticism, and he writes, the best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us as nothing else can. As discussed earlier in this session, Matthew Arnold had immense faith on literature. He had immense faith on poetry. He felt that literature has the power to change society. He gave a theory, a very interesting theory, known as touchstone theory. So he created this theory in which he mentioned that some of the lines of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and John Milton, some of the lines of these famous poets should be considered as touchstones. Touchstones meaning benchmarks. These famous poets' works, their poems, their lines should be considered as benchmarks if any new Victorian poet comes up, his poetry, the new poet's poems, should be compared with the poems of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton. And after the comparison, if the new poet's lines, they are equally good, then that poet's work should be read. So that is a very interesting theory that he proposed, touchstone theory, where any newcomer, any new poet's work should be compared with the legends, the stalwarts, the famous poets such as Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton. So he considered these poets' lines as touchstones, benchmarks. And any other poet's poem should come equal to these stalwarts, these famous poets. The last point in today's session about Victorian age non-fictional prose is about scientific writings. We have earlier discussed religious writing, scientific writings. Charles Darwin, he wrote and published On the Origin of Species in 1859. Now, this work discusses the theory of natural selection. Charles Darwin tried to prove how a human being is related to a non-human animal world. He tried to prove. Science always believes in proofs. His research, his writings, through this particular work on the origin of species, he tried to prove how man is related to non-human animal world. This created a furor, revolt during the Victorian age, because such claims tried to shake the foundation of one's faith. Because till now, people, general people of England, of the whole world, felt that we are devised in the image of God. We are created in the image of God. Descent of Men, which was published in 1871, it deals with how a human being evolved. And it also deals with sexual selection. Both these works, On the Origin of Species and Descent of Men, they were highly criticized. Whenever there is any new thought, whenever there is any new change that happens, it is often difficult to accept. And these new concepts, these new ideas, these new scientifically proven ideas, they raised the debate between religion and science. And it shook the foundation, it shook the very base of a human being, of a Victorian English person who was believing in God, who was believing in Bible, in Christianity. So when Charles Darwin published these works, and he tried to prove that till now, whatever we have learned whatever religious books that has taught us is incorrect. It shook the foundation of the Victorian common person's mind. And that is how there is a constant raging battle throughout the Victorian age between religion and science. I'll end it here. In the next session, we will be discussing the fictional prose characteristics during the Victorian age. Thank you, students.